Hi, this is Sean. I'm back again with All Things Black. I have a new guest here, Professor Kimberly Norwood. Professor Norwood is a professor at Washington University in St. Louis. She's a professor of law. The professor does research on colorism, bias, public education, and other social justice issues in America. Professor Norwood was a member of the national team of experts who worked with Starbucks on their bias training. Professor Norwood has taught in several countries. She even organized the first international colorism conference. Um, Professor Norwood has many other accomplishments and is a scholar in the field of colorism and bias. And we are so excited to have you here today. Welcome.
Thank you, Kimberly. How are you?
I'm good. Okay,
Good.
so today me and Professor Norwood are going to talk about colorism.
Hmm.
Our first question is, how does tone play a role in the socioeconomic area of African Americans? So our question is, how does skin tone play a role in the socioeconomic lives of African Americans?
The question you ask is so heavy and large that we really don't have enough time, right, to even unpack it all in this interview. But what I could do is give you a list of some of the ways in which this manifests. So I would say it makes a difference at almost every level. Most people sort of think, oh, it might just relate to beauty. And beauty is a big thing, right? We know for a fact that lighter skinned women are preferred by men over darker skinned women. Those men that I'm talking about include not only white men or Latino men, but also black men. And that's a huge part of how the what colorism looks like in between people. But it also relates to when you look at not only who's, the dating and the marriage and all of that kind of stuff, but even in education, if we look at even students, for example, um, tons of data that support the fact that the darker the student is, the more likely it is that that student will be disciplined. And that's a higher correlation for darker skinned girls. So we have that data in terms of how students are treated from a discipline perspective in schools. It also includes being picked for play, right? If you go and look at school plays, maybe you'll have, depending on, how diverse the school is, if you have some African American students, they are more likely to be lighter in color than darker. Certainly, when we look outside of schools and we look at the criminal justice system, for example, you are much more likely to be stopped, frisked, arrested, convicted, put on death row, the darker your skin. So we see, we see ramifications not only in the dating, romance, beauty world, but also in schools, education, also in criminal justice. We see it in jobs and employment, in terms of when you're looking at who is getting hired, when you look the higher up one is in the hierarchy, if there are African American, they are more likely to be lighter in skin tone. You don't see as many dark people moving up the ladder in corporate America. And so it affects so many different areas. You could just spend so much time, in each area to show how vast this problem is.
Okay, all right. Um, Okay. So in your article, you talked about beauty working as social capital. Is that something that is for all women, or is that only for a certain type of women? And in your article, well, for people who don't know, social capital is just about being able to move up basically in the social ladder, and how I think that's how you explained it. Depending on like your skin tone.
So, capital is in a way I refer to this thing that people have that allows you access to other things, right? And so when we think of money, we can get dollars and we can use it to buy or get something else. And so there's a social capital that I was referring to in the piece that in the beauty world, right? And so
Right.
um, people who are considered beautiful have more capital, have than people who are not considered beautiful, right? And so there are all kinds of studies that have been done to show that people who are considered attractive, who are considered beautiful, even in elementary school, preschools, teachers, even strangers when they're babies, people stop and they smile at them, they play with them longer. Teachers give more time and loving care to children, the more attractive those children are. And that keeps going up the ladder. It certainly plays a role in dating, right? And how people are attracted to each other. A lot of that is based on physical looks. And so, yeah, so I think when I was talking about social capital and beauty, it was this idea that people who are considered beautiful have more options than people who are not considered beautiful, that they can use their capital in ways, they end up with happy relationships, or they end up getting treated better, or end up getting, paid more attention to and nurtured and mentored and brought through a system and elevated in ways that people who are not considered attractive wouldn't be. So I think that's what I was referring to. And so beauty is very important. Colorism plays a role in that. And so the lighter you are, the higher you are on the beauty scale,
Oh, cool.
right? And
Right.
so in our society, and
Yeah.
so the darker you are, those folks almost would have no social capital in that sense, right? When you're looking at it in terms of the colorism spectrum.
Okay. All right. Um. So you spoke about when you went to China and your experience with colorism there. Are you able to address that at all? How it manifests in the Chinese society?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, so I went to China in 2010, in the spring of 2010, and was just there for a few weeks teaching a class. And I think I had been thinking about doing some work in the colorism space for some time, and it was actually my trip to China that really sort of brought everything to a head. But one day, very early in the trip, I read an article. There was only one newspaper that was in English, so that was the one I grabbed every time I could found it and read it, and it was called the China Daily. And they had an article in there that had I mean, I don't even can't even tell you what drew my attention to it, but it was something about how um, pistachios were being bleached. Pistachio nuts were being bleached, and how this may have some ultimately have some health concerns. So I read the article and it just blew my mind. So I can't remember. I haven't looked at that in many years, but the article said that China was one of the largest consumers in the world of pistachio nuts, and that the nuts are normally, they come in they're shelled, and the shell is a caramel color in its natural state. But the people who are bringing these nuts in felt that that pistachios would be more attractive if they were lighter in color. So they bleach these nuts to remove the color, and then they sell them on the market. And China's a huge consumer of these nuts, and they looked at what people are buying over time, and they found that people will never, almost ever, according to this article, buy a brown or naturally colored pistachio nut. So they interview people, well, why is that? Lighter is better. And so the even in nuts, right? Even the pistachio nuts, we talk about skin tone, but even in nuts, we see this thing that has been implanted that whatever it is, if it's lighter, it's better. So I started, moving through China with that sort of lens, looking at lighter and moving it to skin and thinking about, well, how does that play in China, right? Where when I first looked, I'm looking, most people look to be the same skin tone, right? Like they don't have the same, certainly the same variation that we do in the Black community, for example. And so as I started moving through the society, I saw the people who are the managers, the supervisors, the lawyers, the people who are high up in the economic chain, those people are lighter in skin color than the people who are on the street, right? People who are driving the cabs, people who are working those bikes, people who are janitors, other kinds of people. Those people were darker. And so I began to see the same sorts of variations in terms of even economic opportunity, right? The lighter people have access to a much deeper economic chain than the darker people who are sort of relegated to more lower paying type jobs. Yeah, it was really interesting. So it sort of just blew my mind. And as I talked to more and more people about it, it was absolutely clear. Yes, there is a preference for lighter here. And in that culture, I was told that it's not based on race, certainly, right? But it's more about economics, right? Like that the darker you are, that means that you have to work out in the elements, and you're in a lower socioeconomic class in that sense. But there's a clear divide in terms of how folks are treated based on skin color. So it really got me thinking and really worried, because I knew that the problem existed in Africa. I knew it existed in India. And then now to add China to that, I mean, that's a really large percentage of the world when you add those three groups together. And you're thinking that those people, many other people in those communities, don't like the skin they're in. Right. And so that's why I decided to pursue this work.
I noticed the same thing in Thailand. But I mean, they're
Mhm.
close countries, but it's the exact same way. Like all their material, like their lotions and stuff, have bleaching stuff in it, and like the people I went to school with, it's like 100 degrees outside, and they have umbrellas over their
Yes.
face. And I also noticed that the more the people who were like workers were darker skinned people, but when I went to like the mall, those were where the lighter skinned people were. So
Yeah.
yeah.
It's very true.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's a if China is a that's there's a lot of people in China. So if it's in China, America, and Africa,
Right. China, America. I mean, well, it's in a ton of countries, but as I said, for me,
yeah,
the impetus was
right,
India, Africa, and China, and I was like, oh my God, right?
yeah,
Like,
that's
a lot
everywhere.
of people. Yeah. hmm I hadn't even
Okay,
added the US to that, right? And so,
right.
mhm.
Okay. So we talked about this suspension rates. Okay. So in your paper, you talk about so a lot of times when you talk about colorism, people will say, we're all black to white people. Um, we're all black. That's what they'll say. So when we're speaking about like discrimination or how white people view black people, are both dark and light skinned people as likely to be discriminated against by a white person, or do white people see black people a, a different way depending on what skin tone they are?
I don't want to give you an answer that's based on how white people see black people, right? But I can tell you what studies have revealed, right? I think it is true, it can be true that um, white people generally white people see you're black to them, no matter what, whether you're light or dark, you're still black, right?
Right.
I can hear that, but it can also be true that some people prefer lighter over darker. They're not mutually exclusive concepts,
Oh,
is what I think. And so I think that's right. I mean, I think that if you take sort of arrest records, right? If police arresting people in a particular community, they we can pick a community where the arrests of black men are very disproportionate to their place in the community, for example. And the people who are being arrested can be light-skinned black men and dark-skinned black men, right? Like they all can be in that category. So it doesn't matter whether you're black or light or dark, right? Like you're
right.
in that space. But then we also have data that shows that the darker you are, the more likely you are to be stopped, the more likely you are to be arrested, the more likely you are to be convicted, the more likely you are to be on death row, right? So
Right.
so so you also have colorism being practiced at the same time, right? And so I don't think that those terms are mutually exclusive. I think that you can have people who, some people, black is, it doesn't matter whether you're light or dark, you're still not going to get this job, for example, or right, whatever it
Right.
is. But you can also have preferences of light over dark, and that's clear. I mean, the data on um, how skin tone plays in economics and health and in all of these other areas that we've talked about is clear. So we know colorism is going on, but we also know that racism is going on, right? So
Right.
that's
Right.
they both are existing at the same time.
Right. Okay. Um, so in your paper, you spoke about adoptions.
Hmm.
And that's not the first time I've heard that. So as far as with children getting adopted, um, is there a race and skin tone preference
Yeah,
thing, for lack of better words, going on?
right. So in almost every category, and I would say in every category we've discussed, race is always playing a role,
Okay,
and colorism is also playing a role,
gotcha.
right? So we always have that they coexist. I mean, that is our reality. So we can use the adoption as an example. I think you can't get there's some data that's not available to us. I think data private adopt I can't remember now,
Oh, okay.
it's private or public adoptions, but or non-private, I should say. So I'm think one of them, the data is not available to us, and so we're only looking at a small category. But and again, I can't remember. I um, didn't know we were going to talk about this, and so I didn't go back and look at the article and try to refresh my recollection on what the data was at the time.
It,
But um, but what we saw is that in this, maybe it was in the private area, what we saw was that there's a preference in America when people are adopting. um, they prefer white children, right? That was
right.
the highest level.
Yeah, that's
Not
what it
only
said.
do they prefer white children, but they prefer blonde hair and blue eyes, right? So that's the highest. And so there's a race piece in some senses, right? As we talk
Right.
about race, even though race is a social construction, but um, so you've got a preference for a white baby over a black baby, right? So that's
Right.
the race part. So then when we move to colorism, if you're talking about getting an African American child, what we found is that the lighter you are, the more likely you are to be adopted. Biracial children, lighter in color, are more likely
Right.
to be adopted. The folks who are least likely to be adopted are the darkest children,
Right.
right? So that's colorism that's going on. So in the same space, you've got both things sort of operating.
And what can we do, you think, on a communal level to end colorism?
Oh, that's another long talk. So I don't have the answer, right?
Yeah.
Part of the problem to me is so there are two things that we have to do. Let me start there. One is we in the community, we parents and aunts and uncles and cousins of younger people need to build them up, right? And so there's a whole um, level of work that needs to be done internally in your family kind of
Mm,
thing. So I want to talk about that in a minute. But the other thing that makes this so difficult is that no matter what you do in the family, no matter how much love and support, no matter how much you prop the person up, they are constantly on a daily basis walking out your door and going into a war
right.
zone.
Mhm.
And that war zone is constantly saying, black is ugly,
Right.
dreads are ugly, braids are ugly, you're ugly. I mean, and so we need some work on that side too, right?
Right.
Because I don't even think because colorism continues to be such a thing in the black community, it's certainly not clear that just being having more brown people in the US will solve colorism,
Mhm.
right? Right,
Right.
that we could be a majority brown community and still practice colorism, right? I saw that years ago in Africa, right? When the first time I went to Africa, I went to South Africa. And although it is now run, right, by a black government, right, and has been for years, colorism is clear in in the spectrum of what kinds of work people are doing, who gets hired for this or that, and as you go up, you know what I mean? So
Right.
even though the projections in the US, right, are that we're going to be a majority brown country and maybe 2045-ish,
I just,
that's not going to solve the colorism problem,
right.
right?
Right.
So that we're still going to have to deal with that. And so it's a real multi-layered problem that requires conscious effort. And that includes, you know, us asking hard questions of ourselves about what we value and how we treat people in our lives based on skin color.
Okay, Professor Norwood. Well, I appreciate speaking with you today. Um,
Thank you so much. And thank
I
you for
appreciate.
doing this. This is so important. So I'm so glad you're involved.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your work all the work that you've done in the field. And it's a pleasure getting to speak to you.
Yeah. Keep me in mind. I want to be involved in
I
this.
will, and
Okay.
I'll send you stuff, as it progresses.
As you post. Okay. Very good. Thank you
Thank
much.
you so
Take
much,
care.
Professor.
Have a
Have a
great
good
one.
one. Okay.